Hi, I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action program, where we talk with New England leaders about the imperative to make disciples, do justice, and foster unity to share Jesus and transform New England. Today, I've got a special guest with me, Mary Speta. Mary is the CEO of Amirah New England, but she's also a researcher, educator, speaker, advocate, working to end commercial sexual exploitation. She consults, informs, advises on public policy and legislative efforts. You're going to love hearing from Mary. You're going to love hearing what she's doing. And I hope it will help us be the people of God, doing the work of God, doing justice in our communities. Mary, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so can you help us with what is human trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation? And is there a difference between them? Definitionally, what are we talking about?
Yes, this is a really complex issue that a lot of people have a lot of questions around it, and for very valid reasons. When we're talking about human trafficking, it's really a legal term that we're talking about, and it's defined as an act of labor or a commercial sex act performed as a result of force, fraud, or coercion that usually benefits a third party. Now, when we're talking about children, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking, there's no consent involved. And so we don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. If a commercial sex act has been performed, which is a sex act in exchange for a good or a service, doesn't have to be money, can be food, can be housing, anything like that, it's automatically considered sex trafficking. So human trafficking, there's the federal definition. Every state has its own definition. There's different ways to prosecute it and all that kind of stuff. When we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation, we're sort of taking it out of the legal boundaries and saying this was a person who was exploited sexually and something of value was exchanged. This was not consensual. This was something where a person was taken advantage of. And that really ranges. It can be housing. It can be imaging over apps. It can be pornography. There's a lot of different ways that commercial sexual exploitation manifests itself.
And so make a connection for me, if you would, to justice. We talk about that the church needs to be known for doing justice, but we mean biblical justice, not a political agenda, not a circumscribed view of it. How do you think about this as a justice issue?
It's a justice issue in a lot of different ways. And looking at scripture, we have a God who is very passionate about providing justice who have been harmed in this way. There are very real stories of individuals who have been sexually harmed, who have been assaulted, who have been exploited, and God stepping in and telling the people of Israel, telling the people of God, like, this is what we're going to do to provide justice in this way. So when we're looking at commercial sexual exploitation in the United States and justice from that perspective, we're really looking at the entire system of prostitution, which in and of itself is a system of oppression. Justice here doesn't just look like getting a woman out of prostitution or bringing the people who harmed her, who are her traffickers, who are her buyers, to justice. It also looks like stepping into the gap to prevent it from happening again. And so that looks like safe housing. That looks like welcoming women into community without judging them for what has happened to them or what they did as a result of, oppression or violence or things to survive. It looks like support around substance use. Most people who trade sex use substances in a way to help them disassociate from what's happening, to cope with the trauma that they've experienced. Justice really is about looking at people in these situations as people, real people, where this wasn't a moral failure. We're not talking about issues of immoral sex here. We're talking about people who did what they had to do in order to survive, whether that was someone literally physically threatening their life, the lives of their children, the lives of other family members, or it was to get a place to sleep when it was negative 10 degrees outside.
And so when we're putting someone in a place, you're reminding me of the Old Testament prohibitions on sending your wife away. And part of the issue there was, well, because she's going to starve to death, or she's got to marry another man, and
Yeah.
that would be adultery, or she's got to become a prostitute, because those are the only avenues open to survive.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like we're talking about basically the same thing, as we are putting people in a place where, for my selfish purposes, either to make money off it or for sexual gratification, I'm putting someone in a position where they have no choice but to do this to survive.
Yep, absolutely. Yes. So we're mostly talking about individuals who are facing extreme poverty. We're talking about systemic racism. The majority of people who are exploited through prostitution in the commercial sex trade are women and girls of color. These are particularly people who were first introduced to the commercial sex trade as a child, 13, 14, 15 years old. As a result of someone else wanting to benefit off of their body in some kind of way. So we're absolutely talking about the same things here. We're talking about mostly women and girls who are in situations where they literally, independence is it's not an opportunity for them at all. We're talking about a lot of individuals who were first sexually abused when they were really young, 3, 4, 5 years old, which sets this idea that you're nothing more than a sexual object. And so like this sexualization, this form of oppression, there's this phrase that prostitution is the oldest profession. It's absolutely not. Prostitution is the oldest form of oppression. There is nothing inherently professional about, needing to trade your body 10, 12, 15 times a night in order to eat, in order to afford the place that you're living, etc. Yeah.
So what would you say? Because right now we know there's a movement in Vermont. It's very advanced. In Connecticut, it's at least a dialogue, and you can probably fill me in more on where those conversations are, that we're saying we should be legalizing prostitution as justice, because this, by arresting people who are engaging in prostitution, we are actually inhibiting their rights and making their life harder. And so how do you respond to that argument and dialogue?
Yeah. So multiple studies have been done looking at countries where prostitution has been legalized. So looking at Germany and looking at Amsterdam and other places like that. Studies have been done both from an economic perspective and from a sociological perspective, particularly looking at human trafficking. And pretty much every study has looked at legalization and said, no, this is bad. Legalization is, in theory, it's this idea of, okay, we're not gonna arrest individuals for attempting to survive anymore, etc. We're not gonna be penalizing people in a way that's gonna harm them long term. But what legalization actually does is, first of all, it's an invitation for human trafficking, because traffickers can come in and pose as business owners and open brothels, and the tactics that they use to keep people silent about their experiences, these are the tactics that abusers use. It's very difficult for law enforcement to tell the difference between someone who's being trafficked and someone who's there of their own will, because traffickers literally train people that they're trafficking with the answers that they're supposed to provide to law enforcement, so that they get law enforcement to hear what they want them to hear. And so we've got that. We've got the open invitation for human trafficking. The second thing that we get is this this permissive environment to use another person's body to your benefit. And this is just an extension, basically, of abuse of power. We're looking at individuals who are then perpetuating this objectification of women's bodies, and looking at that as something that I'm going to buy, and not a person who has a life, who has the imago Dei, who has the image of God on them, right? And the third thing that we really see with legalization is government profiting from the exploitation of these individuals. Because with legalization, this comes taxation, there comes regulation, there comes licensure with brothels, there comes business fees, all of those kinds of things. We see this in Nevada, in the few counties where brothel owning is legalized. many of the women who go through those brothels are actually trafficked, and business owners and government are profiting on their exploitation. So legalization, very, very bad idea.
And so you hit on something I think is interesting, because we struggle sometimes in the conversation about systemic whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But you just described a system of, I would call, governance,
Mm-hmm.
where we just want money.
Mm-hmm.
And so we come up with rationalizations for gambling, the lottery, which exploits poorer people, smoking, right? Drinking, higher taxes on that stuff, and on sex, where it seems I'm gonna say we rationalize it's the right thing to do, but at the bottom, at the end result, government really just wants more money.
Absolutely. The system of capitalization, capitalism without checks and balances is really a system of exploitation. So it's interesting because the women that come through our programs, we really talk about economic stability and vocational recovery and those kinds of things. And a lot of times it's almost contradictory, because we're helping people who have been exploited to be successful in a system that's inherently exploitive when they graduate our programs. It's really contradictory. It's contrary to the gospel. It's absolutely contrary to the gospel.
And so now, what would you say to the person who says, "Well, wait a minute, though. This woman has free will, and she made a decision, and she has chosen to sell herself, if we can say it that way, and I think we can. And so there's nothing exploitative here." What would you
Mhm.
say to them?
That's a good question. So, from a policy perspective, usually in policy work, we are approaching policy from a utilitarian mindset. So we want to do what's best for the majority, right? We see this in all kinds of policies. We're really looking at what's best for the majority. In a country that's this big, no policy is going to fit perfectly to everybody. There are absolutely people who choose to engage in the commercial sex trade, and they have an economic alternative, and that's key. If they don't have an economic alternative, this is usually a mechanism for survival. However, those individuals tend to be few and far between. Less than 10% of people who are trading sex in the commercial sex trade, they tend to be white women who are college educated, who are able to do something else, or even have other jobs, and this is something that they do in addition to whatever it is that they're doing in their career. The majority of the commercial sex trade are people who don't want to be there. There's this huge study that interviewed more than 800 people who were trading sex across 9 countries, and it found that 87% of them did not want to be there, but they had no alternative for survival. So when we're looking at policy, we're looking at what do we do that's going to be best for the majority. At Amirah, we support a policy model that's called the equality model, where we are no longer criminalizing people trading sex. It's a partial decriminalization model, kind of similar to Portugal's approach to addiction and substance use. So we are no longer criminalizing the person being traded for sex. She's not going to go to prison for this. She's not going to go to jail. She's not going to get that criminal record and then have to face that the rest of her life. What we are doing is we're continuing to criminalize the purchase of sex, the demand, because it's the demand that drives the commercial sex trade. If we didn't have people who wanted to buy sex, we wouldn't have a commercial sex trade. And that's really where we need to be targeting our efforts, because in this model, the equality model, it's been proven that prostitution rates go down, sex trafficking rates go down, resources for people who have experienced commercial sexual exploitation go up. And the permissive environment of buying someone for their body, that culturally starts to shift, which is really, really important, because when we're talking about the commercial sex trade, we're talking about violence. We're talking about sexual encounters that are not, these are not things that one would typically find in a loving, committed relationship. These are fantasies where, several studies looking at sex buyers have found that sex buyers believe that if they pay for it, she should do it, regardless of whether or not she wants to, regardless if it's comfortable or if it's painful or what it involves, all of those kinds of things. So yes, there are people who choose to do it, but most people don't.
So the premise of my question is faulty because well, she has free will. You're saying the vast majority of the women or men and women engaged in it don't have free will, and either that they have no other option, or they're being physically, mentally, or emotionally coerced, which is a nice way of saying blackmailed.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. The blackmailing level that we see, rises to a level what's often called operant conditioning in psychology terms. So literally tearing down someone's identity and building it back up into whatever the exploiter wants it to be. And my exploiter did this with me, completely broke down my identity, built it back up to be what he wanted it to be, what served him, what was going to benefit his purpose. And then the recovery of that takes years to deconstruct it and build it back into, because you're going from being a human to being a product and then trying to learn to be a human again.
And these are the same kind of, when you talk about this coercion, it's and the process that a trafficker use, the cults like the Moonies years ago, or really even today, it's those same kind of brainwashing mind. And that's also what we see in any abusive relationship, some aspect of those. Isn't that true?
Yes. Pimp controlled trafficking. So pimp, trafficker, these are terms that we often use interchangeably. Pimp controlled trafficking. It has all of the same core tenets as cults, because it's you're turning a person into something you can control.
Yeah. Which is what we would call, I'm a little older than you, we called it brainwashing years ago. Now it's mind control, undue influence, same concepts, right?
Yeah. And so in law, human trafficking law, it's called coercion, because psychological coercion is used in most situations of trafficking, in most situations of exploitation.
And by the way, if I was honest, I'd say I'm a lot older than you, but let's go with a little for now. And so let's back up a little bit. And can you talk about the pathways of, well, how does somebody end up in this kind of situation? Are there some commonalities or themes?
That's a very good question. Exploitation usually starts out with some type of a power imbalance. And it can show up in a lot of different ways, but the ways that we typically see it show up is there's some type of involvement with there's poverty. So there's an economic need here, right? If someone didn't have an economic need, it'd be a lot more difficult to exploit them. The people with an economic need, very real economic need, there's an opportunity there that traffickers often take to step in and say, I can meet all your needs. I just need you to do this thing for me, right? So economic need, that can be, lack of educational opportunity. That can be housing, especially in New England. Our housing costs here are so high. That can also be, as a result of being involved in the foster care system, they didn't finish their high school education or whatever it is. So economic need, huge. Involvement with substance use. The opioid crisis is very intertwined with the commercial sex trade. Many individuals, who end up in a situation of being addicted to a substance start trading sex in order to support their habit. Or it's vice versa. That economic need drove them into the commercial sex trade, and they started using substances to cope with the trauma that they experienced. It can go in multiple ways. We see traffickers also induce forced addictions, where they're sticking needles in people's arms when they're not looking, and forcing these heroin or these addictions or whatever it is. So involvement in addiction, and like I said, past experience with abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Most people who are trafficked, first of all, are trafficked by someone that they know and they trust. So this is a relationship that someone has built with them. They've groomed this person to do what they want them to do. But secondly, they were abused before they ever met their trafficker. So this mindset of objectification is already ingrained, and for me, this was my story. My first sexual abuse experience, I actually don't even remember how old I was. I was 3, 4, 5 years old, something like that. And that happened for a period of years, and that ingrained in me that you are a sexual object. This is what your purpose is. This is what you're good at. This is what other people look at you for. And I was abused by multiple people, so that was enforced over and over and over again. Traffickers step in and they create these relationships, getting people to tell them all of these stories. And then they capitalize on that. They look for what is the insecurity that I can take advantage of here and then tear you down from there.
Yeah. And I think based on other conversations, the conversation is rarely, well, I can help you with money, but I need you to sleep with 12 to 15 people a night. It's, I can help you with money and there's a progression. I just need pictures of you. Am I right? And
it can be that. Yep. A lot of times it comes from almost like manipulating love of like, I love you. If you love me, you'll do this for me. It can absolutely start with kids. What we've seen a lot more in the past decade with the development of the internet and with apps, it's meeting kids in, online and through social media and getting them to slowly break down their barriers by, send me a picture, send me a video, those kinds of things. And then we see them ending up on pornography websites. We see them ending up meeting these individuals and all of a sudden they go missing. It can happen in a variety of ways. Yeah.
So speak, if you will, and this is maybe a hard piece for some folks to hear. How do Christians support this? I want to talk about how Christians fight this, but how do Christians actually support this?
I mean, that one, if we sort of take it from a 30,000 foot view, it's kind of a hard thing to answer in a way where I don't want to give a blanket answer because not every Christian, right? Because a lot of this also comes down to individual decisions. But the women that we work with at Amirah, a lot of them have been bought by Christians. They've been bought by pastors, by priests, by missionaries, by prominent religious leaders, where they could look at the TV and say, "Yep, that guy bought me." So we see sex buying there. We've worked with women who were trafficked by leaders in the church. We worked with a woman whose father was a pastor who trafficked her. So there's individual decisions there of people choosing to exploit. 1 in 14 men purchase sex annually, and 1 in 5 men have purchased sex over the course of their lifetimes. Wow. That's a lot of dudes. That's a lot of guys. And when we're talking about purchasing sex here, there's sort of this common myth that like, if she's just like paying her way through college, it's fine or something like that. There's a lot of excuses that are provided that, this is, first of all, you shouldn't be purchasing sex. Second of all, that's exploitation. You are contributing to human trafficking. And it can be in a strip club. It can be going online with pornography. Most pornography, those are trafficking victims.
But when you say 1 in 5 are purchasing sex, do you mean physically purchasing sex, or is pornography, for example, wrapped up in that?
Physically purchasing sex. 1 in 5 men have physically purchased sex at some point in their lifetime. So
now if we add pornography onto it, and Christians are guilty of pornography for sure, the number is radically higher.
Absolutely, yes. Okay. And so we see the individual decisions there, right? But then the other side of this as well is a lack of accountability in the church when things like sexual assault allegations come up, and not holding leaders accountable, and not having a pathway or a strategy of how are we going to handle this. It creates permissive behavior for abusers, particularly abusers in powerful situations, to continue that kind of abuse. And that's a real problem that we have to address. And in addition to that, in our churches, and I'm not saying that anyone needs to change their position theologically on sex, absolutely not when I say this, but we have to teach consent. We have to teach consent because so many times children are assaulted in a church setting, and because it's an adult or it's someone older than them, it's someone in a spiritual position, they've never had someone tell them before that like, this shouldn't happen. You can say no. Yeah. And that creates permission then to tell someone that it happened. So many people don't report their sexual abuse that happened in the church. This happened to me. This happened to multiple people that I know. I grew up in a tiny little church, in in sort of like rural America, and 5 other women that I know who were raised in that church around the same time were all abused, and by different people. We weren't all abused by the same person, and this is just one church. Yeah. But so often there's not these plans in place. Yeah. The church sort of overlooks it and says, like, well, we don't want to deal with that. That's too difficult. Or there's this permissive behavior for abusers to just let them do whatever.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a number of these high-profile cases of women in particular coming forward over years saying, hey, something's going on, something was done to me, and it being ignored or pushed away or
covered up
for years.
Yeah.
Before it was finally, oh, wow, now it's too compelling. We can't ignore it anymore. And so if we think that can't happen in our local church, I heard one person say that we don't really believe in the total depravity of man, because it can. And to your point, it does. And we've heard that from other women as well. Okay. And so let's flip to the other side. What are Christians, and what specifically are you and Amirah doing about this?
Yeah, sure. So at Amirah, we are about providing long-term pathways out of the commercial sex trade. So when we work with women, we're working with them from a whole person perspective. We're looking at how can we help you overcome the collective trauma that you experienced, everything that led you through the commercial sex trade, like up to entering, through it, getting out of it, all of those kinds of things. We have 23 beds across 3 residential programs in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, and a community resource center where we're helping people actively trading sex, getting out, plugging them into housing, et cetera. All of our programs, we're looking at emotional regulation and stability. We're looking at clinical support, case management, housing, vocational opportunities. I'm not the type of person where I'm thinking like, okay, if she gets a job at McDonald's, she's fine. That's not true. That's not a living wage in New England. We're thinking, how can we set you up for success? Incorporating, mental health, physical health, impact of trauma, interest, like all of those kinds of things, social recovery, spiritual recovery, addressing that moral injury of being objectified in all these ways. Really, I know that I just listed a ton of different things that we do, but really we are, we're a community. And I tell our team all the time, we are the community first. We are a community that is pre-established so that women can get welcomed in, and she's not judged at all from day one. She's understood, she's welcomed, and she is plugged in and connected to people who are going to connect her to the opportunities and resources that she needs for that long-term stability, so that this does not continue to happen again. We see over and over again that the biggest barriers to exit are, first of all, not having a safe relationship, not having even one person, not having a safe community to help you. But then real tangible needs like housing, like job readiness, like clinical support to help, manage things like complex PTSD and anxiety disorder and substance use disorder. Very, very real stuff. So, we're really looking at all aspects here.
But what you just described, it would be very easy for me to listen to and say, wow, that is phenomenal that you are doing that. But that sounds very specialized, very skill-based, and it's all stuff I don't have. What can I do to help?
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of it, is that it is specialized and it is skill-based, and we have the staff members to do it. So when you come to help at Amirah, you're not responsible for any of that. Our volunteers, we love our volunteers. Our volunteers really contribute to the social recovery of our women. We've had a lot of women come in who, for years when they were trafficked, they were taught to not look someone in the eye. And so being able to have a conversation with a volunteer, a non-staff member, and make eye contact is huge. It's huge in their recovery. But without volunteers, we don't have that opportunity. They see us every day. But being able to have a conversation with someone is a huge life skill, so that when they go to the grocery store and they have to figure out something with the cashier and they have to talk face to face, they're not going to, that's not going to be triggering for them. That's not going to be a triggering event. And connecting them to community besides just us. We want them to have real relationships in the community, people that they can plug into when they graduate the home and they settle in. We all need friends. We all need community. We all need someone to call to say, like, the baby was up at 2 a.m. Like, can you come over for a couple hours today so that I can nap? Or, whatever it is, kind of a thing. So the volunteers who help us out at Amirah, we give them the training that they need. A lot of people are afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, and we give them all of that training. We have licensed social workers and mental health counselors on staff, and case managers, and people that manage like things like nutrition in the homes. We have people with lived experience in the commercial sex trade on staff. We've got all these individuals who have this perspective. And so it actually sets volunteers up for a really beautiful opportunity to learn how to help in a really healthy way and truly contribute. So you don't need skills. We'll teach them to you.
Well, so it sounds like I don't need tons of training and equipping to love someone and talk to them, but what I do need, you're going to give me anyway.
Yes.
And you just said the word contribute. So 2 minutes left. Build on contribute, if you would.
Contributing is huge. Yes, the work that we do it's largely powered by individuals. It's powered by the church. Giving Tuesday is coming up, and at Amirah right now, we are trying to make room at the table. We have a prayer that we say every time we gather around a table. We light a candle, and we say, as we light this candle, let us remember the women who are still out there. May they find hope in this light and the courage to one day join us at our table. Well, in order for them to join us at our table, we need a bigger table. So this Giving Tuesday, we have a matching gift. So anyone who contributes, your gift is going to be matched. All of the funds go directly toward the women that we are serving, toward getting them housing, toward getting them plugged into community, toward all of their emotional recovery and their mental recovery that they have to go through. You can have a huge impact at Amirah with just a simple gift of $25 or $10 a month. It can go a very long way.
And where do I go? Give us your website, please.
Go to amirahinc.org, AMIRAHINC.org.
And if you can't find it, go to visionnewengland.org and you can reach out to us. We'll get you connected.
Yes.
Mary, thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for your faithful ministry and for educating us on a tough topic to talk about. And we appreciate your work in a really tough spot. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your willingness to have this conversation.
Thanks. And I'd like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer, and our listeners. I hope this dialogue helps us, as I said at the beginning, be the people of God who do the work of God, doing justice in our world in places where it's desperately needed. Visit visionnewengland.org for past episodes, resources, and to donate to support our work. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.